The wind at Red Mesa Station blew like it was trying to erase the past. Dust clawed at the platform boards. The sky stretched wide and pale, drained of color by too much sun. A sagging water tower leaned to the west as if waiting to fall, and the train that had roared through less than an hour ago was gone, now its echo lost in the canyons. Only one soul remained behind. Talia Rain Redfeather sat barefoot on the sun-scorched bench, knees drawn to her chest, her mother's boots tied together and slung over her shoulder. She didn't cry. She had already cried in the train's washroom beside a hand that had turned colder with every mile, the kind of cold that didn't come back. Crying was done now. Crying didn't fix things. Crying made people look away. She clutched a cloth rabbit with no eyes and frayed ears, the ear poked from her torn pocket, twitching in the wind like it might come alive. Her face was streaked with travel and silence. Her dress, once blue, had faded to the color of river dust. One button was gone. She didn't care. The conductor had lifted her down by the armpits and said, "Wait here. Someone will come." She hadn't asked who, or when, or why. A stray dog had wandered past earlier and sniffed her toes. She hadn't moved. Neither had it. They had understood something about each other. Now afternoon leaned hard into heat. The platform boards creaked and baked. Far off the hills shimmered in layers. Her hands turned the rabbit over and over, slower now, like the rhythm of breath after everything had broken. A horse clopped into earshot. She looked up. The rider wasn't wearing a badge. He wasn't clean like a preacher or sharp like a salesman. He was dusty with a gray hat pulled low and a crate tucked under one arm. The horse was old but steady. He tied it off and began unloading from a small wagon hitched beside the platform. She watched him without blinking. He didn't notice her right away, or maybe he did and pretended not to. She knew about that, how grown folks looked past things they didn't want to solve. But he moved different. Slow, not lazy. Like someone who didn't mind letting the dust settle before stepping forward. After lifting the last of his supplies, he finally glanced her way. Their eyes met. She didn't flinch. He stepped forward, reaching into his coat pocket. What came out wasn't a weapon or a question, just a wrapped sandwich. He crossed the platform, boots thudding softly, and offered it without words. She didn't move. "It's turkey," he said. His voice was gravel, rough, not mean. She took it with both hands. He turned and walked back to the wagon, not waiting for thanks. She peeled the paper slowly, cautiously, as if it might vanish. The first bite was too big. Her jaw ached from chewing, but she kept going. The sandwich tasted like someone had meant it to matter. He adjusted the rope on his last crate, tightened a loop, then paused. She was still watching him. The question came from deep in her throat, low and steady. "Can I spend a day with you?" The wind sucked the sound away as soon as it left her lips. But he heard it. He turned, eyes narrowing, not with suspicion, just searching for the catch, the trick, the thing behind the words. She didn't explain, didn't plead. She had asked all the asking she could afford. He looked down the tracks, looked at the sky, then at her, and he nodded. She didn't wait to be lifted. She slid off the bench, boots thumping against her back, rabbit dangling from her hand like it had always been there. She climbed the wagon's wheel and sat beside him, legs tucked in, arms around her knees. "What's your name?" he asked, once the wagon creaked forward. "Talia Rain." He nodded. "Coulter Gray." They didn't speak again for miles. The land around them rolled in faded yellows and browns, dotted with stubby trees and fence posts leaning into nothing. Thunderheads gathered in the far distance, slow and shapeless. The air smelled like dry grass, and something waiting. Talia swayed gently with the motion of the wagon. Her eyes never left the road. Coulter drove like a man who'd done it 1,000 times, one hand on the reins, the other resting on his thigh. Now and then, he glanced sideways just enough to check she hadn't disappeared. When they reached the split in the trail, he turned left. The gate to his property dragged through the dust, pulled by rust and time. The ranch came into view in pieces, a small barn, a crooked chicken coop, a porch, where the boards looked tired of holding weight. He stopped the wagon. She didn't move until he did. When he climbed down, she followed, jumping lightly. She walked behind him like she'd always known where the steps would be. A dog limped toward them, one ear bent sideways like a broken leaf. It sniffed her leg once, then sat beside her and stayed. She didn't pet it. She just let it be. Inside the house was plain. Not cold, but not warm. Clean, but not in a fussy way. A single chair by the fireplace. A kettle on a hook. The table had 2 chairs, one of them buried under books. Coulter poured a tin cup of milk and slid it across the table to her. She stared at it for a long time before sipping. "Where's your wife?" she asked. He blinked once. Didn't work out. She nodded like that made sense. That night he set a blanket near the hearth. She didn't wait to be told. She curled up next to the dog boots beneath her head rabbit in her arms. He climbed the stairs but left the door half open. He didn't sleep. The window upstairs overlooked the land, flat and faded and full of ghosts. A coyote cried somewhere in the black. He closed his eyes, listening not to the silence, but to the breath of a child downstairs. And in the quiet, something he hadn't felt in years slipped through the cracks, like light through an old roof. In the morning he came down and found her in the barn feeding the chickens. "You know how to do that?" he asked. She shrugged. I watched. He scratched the back of his neck. "You don't have to work. I like feeding things." He watched her carefully stack the feed dust rising in the morning light. The wind stirred the prairie beyond the fence line, quietly, steadily. Inside, a tin cup waited on the table. So did something else neither of them knew how to name just yet. That night the house didn't creak from the wind. It sighed like it had remembered how to inhale. Coulter lay still in his bed upstairs, eyes wide open, listening to the soft stirrings from below. The fire had burned down to a low pulsing glow, and the wind for once hadn't whistled through the cracks in the wallboards. Instead, there was the slow breath of the old ranch house, remembering what it once sounded like to be alive. Below, Talia Rain lay curled on the worn rug, her small frame barely visible beneath the old horse blanket. The dog was stretched out beside her head, tucked over his paws, twitching in sleep. Her boots were tucked beneath her head. The cloth rabbit was gripped tight in one arm, as if letting go might unravel what little remained of her world. Coulter shifted in bed, the wood beneath him groaning with the weight of years and decisions. He turned his face toward the window, toward the starlit night, where the wind pressed gentle against the glass. The room had been quiet for too long, so quiet he'd nearly forgotten what other lives sounded like. He had come to think that silence was peace. But now with her downstairs, with her breath steady and small, it sounded more like absence. He sat up before dawn, pulling on his shirt with slow, practiced movements. When his boots hit the floor, he felt the familiar ache in his knees, the one that came with storms and memory. He didn't bother lighting the lantern. The shape of the house lived in his bones. Downstairs, the fire had died almost completely. Ash glowed soft and faint beneath blackened logs. The dog lifted his head, but didn't rise. Talia was still asleep, one hand resting beneath her cheek, the other holding the rabbit like a secret. Coulter made coffee, the kettle hissing as it boiled. He didn't make noise. He poured into a tin cup and stepped out onto the porch. Morning hadn't broken yet. The sky was still holding on to the last scraps of night. The hills were silhouettes against pale blue. The chickens rustled inside their coop, restless but not calling. Then he heard a creak behind him. She was barefoot again, standing in the doorway, hair a mess of wind and dreams, eyes too old for her face. "You hungry?" he asked, not looking back. She shrugged. "I could be." He nodded and stepped aside. Inside, she perched on the edge of the stool legs, swinging silent and alert. He set a tin plate in front of her with eggs and a slab of sourdough he'd toasted over the flame. "You don't gotta clean the plate," he said as she scraped every bit with the edge of her fork. She glanced up. "Not if it's clean already." He blinked once. A ghost of a smile nearly surfaced. After breakfast, she stacked the tin neatly and wiped the crumbs into her palm. "Can I help with something?" He hesitated. "You ever water a horse?" She blinked. "No, but I think I could." Out in the barn, the light was beginning to filter through the gaps in the boards. Dust floated in the beams like slow-moving ghosts. He pointed to the bucket near the trough. It was heavy for her sloshing water down her front as she dragged it one slow step at a time. She didn't ask for help, just set it down and went for another. Coulter leaned against the post arms, crossed, watching. She worked like someone who knew what it meant to need approval but didn't expect it. Later, he brought out a brush and showed her how to tend to the mare. "She likes behind the ears," he said. Talia ran the brush there gently, then nodded. "I like behind the ears too." He looked at her, not sure whether to laugh or kneel. The mare snorted softly. The barn smelled of hay and old wood and the faint, sweet scent of oats. When the work was done, Coulter handed her a dry cloth for her hands. She wiped them, then folded the cloth neatly as if that too mattered. Inside, the sun had reached across the floorboards, warming the corners of the house. Coulter handed her a charcoal nub and a torn piece of butcher paper. "You draw sometimes." She sat cross-legged on the rug and began with careful lines. Not fast, not frantic, each stroke chosen. He watched from the table, hands wrapped around a coffee cup, his eyes drifting between her and the window. The door opened without a knock. Marta Benavides stepped in, parasol tucked under her arm, sharp eyes scanning the room like a judge with a sentence already in mind. Coulter didn't rise. "Mornin', Marta." She eyed the girl, then the drawing. "Didn't believe it till I saw it myself," she muttered. Talia looked down at the paper. "She ain't a stray dog, Marta. She's not yours either." Coulter poured a second cup and set it on the table across from him. "You come to drink or accuse? I came to ask what in God's name you're thinking. This town don't forget." Talia kept her eyes on the drawing. Marta tilted her chin. "You really think you can keep her here with your name after everything?" Coulter's jaw tensed. "I think I got more kindness in this house than most pews in town." "She'll break your heart." He looked at the girl who hadn't looked up once. "Maybe that's the point." Marta scoffed. "The Burkes are asking. Got room, got papers." Coulter said nothing. Marta left without finishing the coffee. When the door clicked shut, Talia's hand tightened on the rabbit. Coulter knelt beside her. "She's got opinions," he said. "Everyone does. You scared?" Talia didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I don't get scared so much as ready." He stood. "Good. Let's get ready then." That evening, she brought in wood without being asked. He made stew. She peeled carrots. When they ate, she cleared both their plates. As the fire burned low, she pinned her newest drawing to the shelf near the hearth, his boots beside hers, both beneath a sky full of wind. Then she laid her boots by the door and curled up on the rug. Coulter watched her as he put out the lamp. The house exhaled again. And somewhere outside, just beyond the edge of hearing the sound of hoofbeats, approached down the trail. She burned her fingers on the skillet and didn't whimper, just held them out like she trusted someone would care. The skillet had been too hot, and the handle slick with oil from Coulter's earlier attempt at eggs. Talia had reached for it without hesitation, wanting to prove she could help. It hissed against her palm, but she didn't drop it. Her shoulders went tight. Her lips pressed into a straight line. Then she turned quiet and calm and extended her small hand toward him, fingers red and quivering. Coulter didn't say a word. He grabbed the water bucket, dipped a cloth, and wrapped her fingers gently. She flinched just once, not from pain, but from the shock of being tended to without anger, without blame. "You don't gotta do everything," he said as he checked the burn. "I know," she answered, "but I want to." Her voice carried something old in it, too steady for a child, too quiet for someone trying to impress. Coulter finished wrapping her hand, tied the knot soft, and nodded. She went back to the table without another word. Outside, the wind had picked up again. It stirred the porch swing so that it creaked, even though no one sat in it. Dust rolled across the yard in loose ribbons, and the sky wore a wide streak of white cloud that might mean rain or might mean nothing at all. After breakfast, Coulter hitched the wagon. "Need to pick up some flour," he said. "You can come if you like." Talia didn't answer. She just went to get her mother's boots. They were too big and flopped when she walked, but she didn't complain. She laced them tight and climbed onto the wagon with the help of the wheel spoke. The dog tried to follow, but Coulter waved him off. "You stay." Talia's hair was tied back with a frayed ribbon she'd found in a drawer. It wasn't clean, but it held. She sat straight, hands folded in her lap, the cloth rabbit tucked in beside her. The ride to town was quiet. The trail was wide and open, flanked by juniper scrub and fences that hadn't been mended in years. Hawks circled above the canyons, and the sound of wagon wheels rolling over gravel was the only music. Halfway there, she pointed to the sky. "What kind of cloud is that?" He squinted. "That one's just passing. Won't drop anything." She nodded. "Storms always come. Sometimes they leave things behind." He glanced at her but said nothing. When they reached town, the mood changed. People noticed. They always did. The general store sat near the square, old brick and dusty windows. The front porch was warped with years, and the screen door slammed if you let it. Marta Benavides stood behind the counter, her apron dusted with flour. Her eyes narrowed as Coulter stepped through the door, Talia at his side. Gray Marta said, polite but clipped. "Mornin'," he returned. "Need flour. Sugar, too." Marta's gaze shifted to the girl who stood beside a row of glass jars, her fingers grazing the marbles inside. She didn't speak, didn't touch. "Traveling companion?" Marta asked. He met her eyes. "She's staying a while." Marta said nothing, just nodded and reached for the sack. "Looks thin," she said. "She's been traveling." Marta glanced toward the child again. "That's so." When he turned to pay, Talia whispered something. "What's that?" Coulter asked. She pointed to the marbles. "Can I pick one?" He nodded once. Just one. She chose a red one with a swirl of yellow inside. Fire and sunlight. She held it in her palm like it meant something. "You ever play?" he asked. She shook her head. Never had no one to lose to. They left with the flour and sugar, the marble wrapped in a scrap of paper in her pocket. Outside, a few townsfolk paused to watch them pass. Mrs. Patch stood on the porch of the sewing shop, arms folded like a gate across her chest. The preacher's wife was on the corner, speaking with the Burkes. Elsie Burke wore a bonnet that hadn't seen wind in years. Grady Burke tipped his hat too slow. She'd look sweet in blue, Elsie said loud enough to be heard. She looks fine now, Coulter replied without stopping. Back on the wagon, Talia didn't speak until they were out of earshot. They don't know you. He didn't answer. They think they do, she added, but they don't. The wind blew hard from the south, kicking up grit that stung the eyes. Talia squinted her hand, resting lightly on Coulter's sleeve. Just for a moment. By the time they got back to the ranch, the dog was barking at the wind, and the chickens had scattered into the corners of the coop. Talia climbed down on her own boots, slapping the dirt. Inside, she placed the red marble on the windowsill where the sun could hit it. The glass caught the light and spun it into streaks across the floor. "It's mine," she said. "But I want to see it shine." Coulter didn't reply. He just watched her with the kind of quiet a man keeps for things he doesn't know how to name. That night she fell asleep with the dog again, the rabbit clutched to her chest. Coulter sat longer than usual at the table, the fire throwing light against the walls. He looked at the red marble, the boots by the door, the drawing still tacked to the shelf. In the quiet, he whispered into the shadows, "You're worth it too." He hadn't meant to say it out loud. From the rug, barely audible, a sleepy voice replied, "I know." The next morning, the sheriff rode in early. Dust curled under his horse's hooves as he tied it to the rail and stepped onto the porch. Coulter met him at the door. "Morning, Gray Sheriff," Boone said. "Sheriff." Boone took off his hat and scratched his head. "Got some word from the chapel. The Burkes are asking." "I figured. They got papers ready. Preacher's wife made inquiries. Council's leaning toward approving 'em." Inside, Talia stood just beyond the curtain, holding her rabbit unmoving. "You got 2 days," Boone said. "Then it's their call." Coulter didn't reply. "She ain't yours, Gray." He looked toward the kitchen, then at the small boot prints in the dirt just outside the porch. She didn't ask to be. She looked up and whispered, "I can be quiet if that helps." But it was her silence that made his heart ache. The house held its breath after the sheriff left. The dust he kicked up still clung to the porch rail, and Coulter watched it swirl in the morning sun like it might offer an answer. He didn't close the door behind him. He just stood there, one hand on the frame, the other at his side, jaw locked. Inside, Talia hadn't moved from behind the curtain. She had heard everything. Her rabbit was pressed against her chest like armor, and her red marble sat forgotten on the windowsill, the light no longer touching it. Her bare feet were silent on the wooden floor, her body too still for a child. He turned back inside slowly, careful not to startle her. She didn't flinch when he stepped into the room. Her eyes met his wide and glassy but dry. "Did he mean it?" she asked. Coulter didn't answer right away. "They want me gone," she said. "No," he said quietly. "They want you placed. That's the same." He moved toward her but stopped short of reaching out. "No one's taking you anywhere today." She looked down the tip of her boot, scuffing the floor. "But maybe tomorrow." The weight of it sat between them like a stone. Coulter couldn't lie. He wouldn't. Talia's voice dropped to a near whisper. "I can be quiet if that helps. Real quiet. I won't bother you." He took a slow breath. "You don't have to earn your space here." She blinked, uncertain. "Then why does it feel like I do?" He had no answer to that. Later, she fed the chickens without being asked, scattering seed with small, careful hands. The wind pulled at her hair, her ribbon gone. The dog followed her limp and loyal tail, wagging once for every 3 steps. Coulter watched from the porch with a coffee cup in hand, staring into the middle distance where the land flattened out into golden brush and hills that looked close but never were. His eyes weren't on the horizon, though. They were on the girl who worked too quietly, like if she made too much noise, someone would remember she was still there. By mid-morning, he went to the barn to patch a loose hinge on the tack shed. Talia followed, sitting on the edge of the hayloft, with her knees tucked in, watching him hammer. "Did you ever try?" she asked after a while. He looked up. "Try what? To have kids?" The hammer paused mid-swing. "Yeah," he said. "What happened?" He set the hammer down gently on the workbench, the metal clinking against the wood. "They didn't stay." She nodded like she understood. "Was it the mama's fault?" He shook his head. "They said it was mine." Silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't sharp. Just tired. "My mama used to say I was too loud, too much," she murmured. "But worth it." Coulter looked up at her, his face unreadable. "You're quiet now," she added. He leaned back against the barn wall. "Yes, I am. You still worth it." He didn't answer. That evening she helped shell beans on the porch, the empty pods piling in a rusted tin bowl. The dog lay at her feet, and the setting sun made the hem of her dress glow like the edge of fire. Coulter sat beside her, whittling a strip of wood down to nothing, just to keep his hands busy. When the beans were done, she picked up a handful and held them up to the sky. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Seeing if they change color," she said. He smiled, just barely. After supper, Talia placed her boots beside the door again, toes lined up next to his. She didn't ask to stay on the rug. She just laid down the rabbit under one arm, a blanket pulled to her chin. Coulter watched her from the table, the lamplight flickering in his cup. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the window panes, making the rafters groan. A shutter slapped once, then again. She didn't stir. He sat a little longer before dousing the lamp. As he passed her, she spoke without opening her eyes. "You're not going to let them take me, right?" He paused. "Not if I can help it," he said. Her fingers clutched the edge of the blanket tighter. The next morning she was up before him. He found her by the fence line picking wild blackberries in a tin pail. Her fingers were stained purple and one cheek had a smudge of juice. She held up the pail when she saw him. "They're sweet if you wait for the right ones." "Any thorns?" he asked. "Yeah," she said, grinning. "But you learn where they hide." He walked the fence, slowly checking the posts, giving her space. The dog stayed between them like a moving shadow. When they returned to the house, she set the berries on the table with quiet pride. He ruffled her hair in passing, and she leaned into it without being asked. After breakfast, she asked if she could draw again. He handed her a piece of brown paper and a stub of charcoal. She sat by the window, tongue pressed to her lip, focused. When she was done, she showed him. It was the porch, his boots and hers side by side beneath the window, with the marble catching the sun. He looked at it a long time. "I'll find a nail for that." She smiled, small and shy. By afternoon, the wind had settled and the land wore a calmness that didn't last. But for now, it held. Coulter stood out front, checking the sky for signs of change when he heard the crunch of gravel and the sound of polished boots that didn't belong. The Burkes were coming up the path. Talia saw them first from the window. She didn't say a word, just stepped back away from the light clutching the frame. Her fingers turned white at the knuckles, and her marble rested in her palm like a wish she wasn't sure she could ask for. Coulter stayed on the porch, shoulders squared. The Burkes wore Sunday smiles and shoes without dust. Grady's hat was cocked just so. Elsie carried a folded blue dress over one arm. They stopped at the bottom of the steps. Grady smiled. "Morning, Gray. We thought we'd save the preacher the trouble." He glanced past Coulter's shoulder. "There she is. My, what a delicate thing." Talia didn't speak, her chin tucked low. No need to be afraid, sweetheart, Elsie cooed. She's not going with you, Coulter said, voice level. Grady tilted his head. You don't have guardianship. Elsie smiled wider. We've already prepared her a room, curtains and all. She has a room. Coulter's voice didn't rise. Elsie stepped forward. We're offering her stability. She's not a display, he replied. She's not furniture to arrange. Behind him, Talia breathed through her nose, chest trembling. She'll be safe with us, Grady said. Coulter turned his head slightly. She's safe now. Elsie's smile thinned. This isn't about you. Coulter looked at the girl in the doorway. You want to go with them? He asked gently. Talia shook her head once. Say it, he said. I want to stay. The air around them stilled. Elsie adjusted her gloves. She doesn't understand what's best for her. I do, Coulter said. And she does. Grady's mouth tightened. If this goes to vote, it'll get messy. I've stood in messy, Coulter said. This ain't it. Elsie looked past him once more. We'll be back. Coulter didn't answer. He stepped back inside and closed the door behind him. Talia was still standing there, hands at her sides, marble in one, rabbit in the other. He didn't speak. She didn't need him to. They looked at her like she was a prize he forgot to wrap, but she never looked up from the floor. The morning after the Burkes left the house was still. Talia hadn't said much at breakfast. She ate slowly, chewing until the eggs went cold. Her shoulders curled like she was trying to disappear into the chair. Coulter poured coffee and said nothing. Sometimes silence held more than explanation. Outside, the air smelled of wet earth, though it hadn't rained. Just the kind of heavy humidity that made the fence posts sweat and the chickens restless. A low fog hugged the grasslands, the kind that lingered around boots and stirred suspicion in folks who preferred seeing what was coming. Coulter hitched the wagon late in the morning. Supplies were running low again. The girl watched him from the porch, her hands tucked under her thighs, her red marble missing from the windowsill. Coming, he asked. She nodded, but her eyes stayed on the porch boards. She walked to the wagon in silence, boots too big and still untied. She climbed up without help, setting the rabbit in her lap, and the marble now wrapped in cloth in her pocket. The dog trotted beside them until the fence line, then stopped watching them disappear down the trail like a sentry too old to follow. Town was awake early that day. Laundry lines stretched like flags across backyards. Children played in dusty yards, while women swept porches and stared when the wagon passed. Coulter kept his eyes forward. Talia did too. At the general store, Marta Benavides stood behind the counter, pretending not to notice when they stepped in. The bell above the door jingled like a warning. Coulter reached for coffee beans and oats. Need flour too. Marta didn't move right away. You got a lot of mouths to feed now. 2, he said. You countin' the dog? He turned slowly to look at her. I count who eats. She lifted a brow, then reached for the sack of flour. Talia wandered to the back of the store where the bins of dry goods sat. She paused in front of a row of spools, running her finger along the threads red, blue, gray. She didn't touch any of them. Just looked like she was trying to memorize what choice felt like. Mrs. Patch entered carrying her sewing bag and the kind of energy that made rooms feel colder. She spotted Talia immediately. Well, she said, there's our little mystery. Talia didn't move. She got a name, Patch asked, addressing Coulter directly. She does. Patch sniffed. Girl like that's got no place on a ranch with a man living alone. She's got a place. She turned her gaze back to Talia. You know you'd look nice in blue. Talia didn't look at her, just pressed her hand tighter around the marble in her pocket. You know, Patch continued, the Burkes got a room waiting. Quilt and all. Coulter paid in silence. Talia followed him to the wagon, stepping carefully over the porch rail. When she climbed up, her voice was barely louder than the wind. "They look at me like I'm a thing." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They rode in silence until the edge of town. Then Talia asked, "Did you always live out here alone?" Coulter glanced at the horizon. "Not always." "Do people always talk like that, only when they think they know better?" Talia looked down at her hands. "They don't know me. They think they do." "Why don't you tell them different?" Coulter's jaw flexed. Not sure they'd listen. Talia leaned back against the bench, letting the wind pull strands of hair across her face. "I don't want to be taken care of by people who only want to be seen doing it." He turned to look at her fully for the first time since they'd left the store. "What do you want?" She answered without blinking. "Someone who doesn't mind that I stay." Back at the ranch, the chickens scattered when the wagon pulled up. The dog barked once and limped to meet them. Inside, the girl placed the marble back on the sill. The light had shifted, but the swirl still caught it just right. "That's better," she said. Coulter unpacked the supplies while she set the table for two. When he turned to check the fire, he saw her folding napkins in half, creasing the edges with precision. "You don't have to do that. I like when things feel finished." That night, she tried cooking cornbread. She put in too much salt, not enough flour, and burned the edges. When she tasted it, her face wrinkled. She pushed the plate away. "It's bad." Coulter picked up a piece, took a bite, and nearly choked. He reached for his coffee, swallowed hard, then grinned. "Well," he said, "we'll try again." She stared at him. He nodded. "You cook, I supervise." She smiled, the kind that barely lifts the corners, but reaches the eyes. After supper, she drew another picture, a small house with smoke curling from the chimney and 2 pairs of boots on the porch. Hers, smaller, slightly tilted. She handed it to Coulter wordlessly. He pinned it to the wall beside the first drawing. "Looks like home," he said. She didn't answer, just reached for the rabbit and curled up on the rug. Coulter watched her for a long time before dousing the lamp. The fire was low. The room smelled of smoke and bread that hadn't risen. Just as he turned to go upstairs, she spoke. "Do people think you're strange, some?" Why, he turned back to her. "I don't say much." She nodded. "Me neither. You ever want to? I think I do. Just not to them." He pulled the blanket up over her shoulders. "That's fair." The dog settled at her side, sighing deep into the floorboards. Coulter lingered near the stairs, hand on the rail, heart heavier than usual. Outside, the wind had stilled, but something in the air still shifted like breath before a storm. He didn't sleep easily that night. At first light, Talia was already outside, brushing the mare's coat, with the same slow care she used for everything. Her braid had come undone, and her shirt was buttoned wrong, but her hands moved steady, and the horse didn't flinch. Coulter stood in the doorway watching. Then the dog barked once, sharp and sudden. He turned to see a rider approaching from the south, dark hat, polished boots, and a satchel under one arm. A letter. Coulter stepped off the porch, the wind picking up again. The rider handed him the envelope without a word, then turned and rode off, coat snapping behind him. Coulter unfolded the paper, read it once, then again. A hearing. 3 days. A vote. Inside, Talia reached for the red marble on the sill. It slipped, hit the floor, and rolled across the wood like a truth no one could ignore. She didn't ask if the bed was hers, she just folded the quilt, touched the wood, and breathed like it might stay. The letter from the council sat on the kitchen table, its creased edges catching the morning light. Coulter had read it 3 times before setting it down. Talia hadn't asked what it said. She just watched his face the way someone watches the sky to see if the clouds mean rain. Outside, the world moved as usual, The dog barked at shadows. The hens clucked about nothing. But inside the house, something had shifted. The floorboards felt heavier underfoot. The air seemed to wait. Coulter found her in the barn brushing the mare again, even though he'd done it yesterday. Her strokes were patient, careful, like she was trying to remind herself how softness felt. He leaned on the post and didn't say a word until she turned. "They're gonna make you say it," she said flatly, "whether I stay or not." He crossed his arms. "They'll ask. But that doesn't mean they know." She looked down at the brush in her hand. "It's easier to take things from people when you pretend it's for their own good." He swallowed. "You're not a thing." She nodded, not in agreement, but as if she'd already decided how much that truth could protect her. By mid-morning, he cleared the back room. It had been a catch-all space, dusty shelves, crates of old tack, a broken rocking chair, and stacks of books from a dream Mabel once had about starting a school for the nearby settlement kids. Coulter opened the lone window. Light stretched in across the floor like it hadn't in years. He swept it clean, patched the curtain, and found a narrow bed frame stored behind the barn. He hammered it together, slow but sure, like he was building something that had to last. The mattress wasn't new, but it was firm. He folded a quilt on top one Mabel had stitched with scraps before the last baby didn't make it. On the wall above the headboard, he nailed one of Talia's drawings, the one with the 2 pairs of boots side by side, the sky above them thick with charcoal stars. When it was done, he didn't call for her. He just left the door open. Talia found it before lunch. She stood in the doorway for a long time, rabbit dangling in one hand, her other brushing the worn edge of the frame. The light from the window landed on her face, and for a moment she looked like any other girl with a room to call her own. She didn't say anything at first. She stepped inside, touched the folded quilt, then ran her fingers over the edge of the wooden frame like she was checking to make sure it was real. "This for me?" she asked, voice flat but small. "It's a room," Coulter said. "Might not be much." She looked at him. "You folded it real good." He nodded once, awkward. Then she surprised him. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his middle. It wasn't tight, but it wasn't unsure either. Her head barely reached his chest. He froze, caught between instinct and memory, then bent down and returned the hug, firm and brief, but enough. After they parted, she sat on the edge of the bed, feet dangling. "Smells like dust and pine," she said. I opened the window. She nodded again, like she appreciated that. That afternoon, Coulter saddled the mare and handed her the reins. "Walk her around the pen," he said. "Just slow." She looked up at him like he'd handed her the whole prairie. Her boots were too big and flopped a little with each step, but she walked that horse in circles with her chin high. Every few steps, she glanced over to make sure he was still watching. He was. When the sun started to dip low behind the hills, she came inside, cheeks pink from wind and pride. Coulter was setting the table. Stew bubbled on the stove and the dog stretched out near the fire tail, thumping as she entered. She peeled the carrots without being told, handed them over, one by one, her fingers stained and sure. After supper, she placed her boots beside his again, then carried her rabbit under one arm and stepped into the room without hesitation. She sat on the bed, legs folded, and just looked around. Coulter watched from the doorway. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm something. You don't have to sleep here tonight. If you'd rather, I want to." He nodded, hesitated. She reached for the lamp on the small table beside her bed. "Can I leave it on a little?" He lit the wick gently. "As long as you need." She lay back, quilt up to her chin, eyes wide in the low, flickering light. "You think they're coming again?" she asked. Probably. She didn't speak for a while. Then softly, I can be real polite if they ask. He leaned against the frame. You don't owe them anything. They'll say I'm confused. Are you? She shook her head. Then say what you mean. I did. He nodded once, then stepped out. He left the door cracked. Later, long after the lamp had gone out, he found her again. Not in the bed, but curled on the floor outside the room. Her rabbit under one arm, the red marble resting by her cheek. He bent down and lifted her light as breath and carried her back into the room. He tucked the quilt around her and set the marble on the sill. Before he turned to leave, she stirred. I was scared it'd go away if I fell asleep in it, she murmured. It won't. You sure? He placed a hand gently on the quilt. I'm sure. That night the wind blew steady, not sharp like a lullaby hummed through canyon walls. The ranch didn't creak. It settled. And in town, under lantern light at the chapel, steps, someone nailed another notice to the door. The Burkes had filed early. A final vote was coming. But for now, in a small room with dust and pine in the air, a girl slept in a bed that held her weight without question. And just outside her door, a man sat in the hall with his coffee going cold, listening to the sound of breath that made his house feel like a home again. She's just a little girl with old eyes, and for the first time she's looking at something that doesn't want to leave. Coulter felt it the moment he stepped into town, the way silence tilted just slightly when a man carrying truth walked through people who liked things quiet. The sun hadn't burned off the chill yet, but the gossip had already warmed the steps of the post office, the general store, and the chapel. Word traveled faster than horses in Eden Ridge. He nodded to the sheriff without slowing. Sam Boone gave a tight nod, back eyes shifting toward the notice board on the chapel. Coulter didn't need to read it. He knew what it said. The Burkes had made it formal. A request to place Talia in a proper supervised household with adequate schooling and Christian guidance. Words wrapped in manners pointed like barbed wire. Inside the general store, Bonnie James was restocking the flour bin, her thin shoulders straightening when she saw him. You're early, she said without turning. I need more oats. Oats and what else? Respectability, a Bible for your new daughter. He exhaled through his nose. Just oats, Bonnie. She filled the sack, lips tight. Folks are nervous, Coulter. Think maybe you've lost your grip. Coulter looked her straight in the eye. I've never held tighter. Outside, the air felt thicker. He caught a glimpse of Eleanor Burks striding toward the schoolhouse veil, bouncing against her shoulders, like she was late for a sermon no one asked her to give. Behind her, Emmett trailed close, tall, polished, and soft-palmed. The kind of man who offered help with a gloved hand, then scolded the dirt it touched. Coulter mounted up and rode home slow. The sun was high by the time he reached the ranch, where the real things waited, fence lines, animals, and a girl kneeling by the creek bed with a bucket full of flat rocks and a rabbit watching from the grass. Talia stood when she saw him, eyes squinting against the light. I made a new row behind the barn, she called. For the small ones. Good, he said. They'll grow faster where it's warmer. She nodded, brushing hair from her face. You go into town, I did. She didn't ask what they said. She knew better. Instead, she held up one of her rocks painted with careful dots and symbols, a tiny world clutched in her palm. This one's for the sill, so it knows we see the sky even inside. He took it, turned it over in his calloused fingers. It'll like that. They worked together until sundown, fixing the outer fence where the wire had sagged. Talia wore his old gloves doubled at the wrist and passed him tools like she'd always been part of this place. Later at supper, she was quieter than usual, pushing beans around her plate. "You okay?" he asked. "Do people always look at you like you stole something, only when they want what you have?" She looked up then. "But I didn't steal you. No, darlin', you didn't." That night, Coulter sat on the porch after she went to bed, watching the horizon darken to indigo. Willard Stokes arrived just past moonrise dust, trailing behind his buggy. He stepped onto the porch like a man balancing too many opinions at once. "I ain't here as Mayor Willard said. I figured. I'm here 'cause I remember when your Mabel died. I remember who brought your horse in from the woods. I remember who sat silent with you for 3 nights and didn't ask you to pray." Coulter didn't look up. "You also remember whose baby didn't make it, Willard." "I do." They sat quiet a moment. Willard rubbed his beard. "This girl, Talia, she's different. She's alive." "I know," Willard rocked forward on his heels. "But she's not yours." Coulter turned, then his eyes dark but steady. "You ever see someone lose their whole world and still try to plant tomatoes?" Willard swallowed. "She's mine now, and not because I said so, but because she stayed." Willard nodded slowly. "The vote's in 2 days." "I'm aware." Willard sighed. "Just make sure she's got shoes on for it. Town likes things tidy." After he left, Coulter stood in the quiet. The next morning he woke before dawn, found Talia already up-dressed and sitting on the porch rail, with her boots laced tight and the red marble in her pocket. "You were right," she said as he stepped out. "About what they want, what I have." "And what's that?" She looked up, eyes calm. "A place." He reached for his hat, heart full and hurting at the same time. "We've got 2 days," he said. "Plenty of time to show them what's theirs to envy." That afternoon, Sarah Callahan arrived midwife herbalist, and the only woman in town who'd ever spoken her mind and been thanked for it. She stepped down from her wagon with a satchel of herbs and a jar of honey. "Brought this for her throat," she said. "Kids don't need to sound hoarse when defending what's theirs." Talia smiled up at her like Sarah was a queen. "Come inside," Coulter said. They sat at the table while Sarah asked questions no one else had thought to. "Do you sleep through the night, most nights? Do you feel safe?" "Yes." "Does he yell?" Talia looked at Coulter. "Only at the weather." Sarah chuckled. "That's fair." Later, as Sarah prepared to leave, she whispered something into Talia's ear and tucked a small pouch into her hand. Talia nodded, serious as a preacher. When Sarah climbed back into her buggy, she turned to Coulter. "She's more than just alive. She's choosing to grow. Let them try and take that." As the sun set, Coulter found the stone Talia had painted on the window ledge. Under it, the red marble shimmered, and above them, both the first stars began to show. Don't matter how loud they speak in town, the quiet things we build out here, they last longer than their noise ever will. The prairie sun stretched across the land, like a slow-breathing animal casting golden threads through the trees that lined Coulter's pasture. Talia stood barefoot at the edge of the tall grass, her toes curling into the cool dirt as the scent of clover carried on the morning breeze. She wasn't alone. Cassidy Gray, the girl from the orchard downriver, was crouched beside her, sleeves rolled up, examining a broken bird's nest they'd found in the barn rafters. "You think they'll come back for it?" Talia asked. Cassidy, older by a year and worldly in a way only girls with both parents and Sunday dresses could be, shook her head. "They usually don't. Not when it's been touched." Talia swallowed, looking at the scattered twigs. "Then we'll build it better." The two of them worked under the barn's shade hands, moving with the quiet urgency of girls who understood more than they let on. Behind them, the ranch hummed with steady life hooves crunching dry dirt, the creak of the water pump, and the occasional distant call of Coulter's voice as he worked the east fence line. Inside the house, Coulter leaned over the kitchen table, hands flat, jaw tight. Sheriff Sam Boone sat opposite him, hat in hand, shifting in his chair like it bit. They're pushing the hearing forward. Day after tomorrow. Coulter nodded once. Of course they are. Boone scratched the back of his neck. There's pressure. Burke's filed formal complaint. Said you're emotionally unfit and socially unqualified to raise a minor. Coulter grunted. They ever raise a fence without breaking something? Boone offered a small smile, then sighed. You know they're loud. Got sway with the mayor and half the church board. Coulter's voice stayed level. You think she should be taken from me? Boone looked away. No, but they think a quiet man with calloused hands and no wife must be hiding something. Then let them come look. Let 'em see what we built. Boone stood. They will. In court. That night, Talia and Cassidy sat on the porch, their makeshift nest drying in the breeze. Talia said quietly, If someone tried to take you from your home, what would you do? Cassidy stared out at the horizon, then shrugged. Depends who's taking me. If it's someone mean, I'd run. If it's someone rich, I'd hide. If it's someone proper, I'd tell him I snore loud and can't sit still. Talia smiled but didn't laugh. Cassidy studied her. They trying to take you? Talia nodded slowly. Well then, Cassidy said, pulling the nest closer, we better finish this. Might need to hide something small inside. The next morning, Sarah Callahan returned. Her presence filled the room like fresh bread, warm, necessary, unspoken. She brought dresses, books, a mirror for Talia's room. Said nothing of the hearing. Why, Talia asked as she laid the dresses across the bed. Sarah smoothed a sleeve. Because when people try to take something from you, the best thing you can do is show them how much you've already got. Coulter watched from the doorway, arms crossed, eyes tired. Sarah glanced at him. You cleaned the windows 2 days ago. She'll be seen through them. Make sure they shine. Later, Talia found Coulter in the barn oiling the saddle. You think they'll listen to you? He didn't look up. I don't care if they listen. I care if they see. See what that you belong. The day before the hearing, a letter arrived. No stamp. No return. Just a piece of folded parchment tied with string left on the gatepost. Coulter opened it alone in the workshop. The handwriting was jagged, uncertain, but familiar. Mabel's sister, Ruth. She's a child of ashes and wind. I know what they become if left without anchor. I won't stand against you, but I won't stand with you either. Be sure she grows roots before they call her storm. He folded it and placed it in the drawer beside the broken watch Mabel had worn the day she died. That night, Coulter found Talia curled up on the porch bench, arms wrapped around the red marble and one of Sarah's books. You scared? He asked. She shook her head. I'm angry. Why? Because they don't know me. They didn't watch me sleep on hay or eat beans for 6 days straight. They didn't teach me how to mend a fence or let me plant tomatoes where the sun kisses the hill. He sat beside her. That's what we'll show them. You think they'll believe us? No, he said, but we'll speak the truth anyway. In the distance, coyotes called. The wind rustled the tall grass like it carried secrets. Inside the house stood still every board nail and beam, a piece of the life they had shaped without permission. As Talia drifted to sleep, Coulter stood guard under the stars. Not because he feared the dark, but because he knew some lights weren't meant to go out. Not without a fight. I stood there in front of folks who never saw me as anything but dust on their boots, and I said, she ain't my blood, but she's my heart, and I'll fight any man or law who tries to tear her from it. The courthouse sat like a stone giant in the middle of Windermere, worn by wind and scandal, its steps smoothed by years of uncertain verdicts, and men who thought justice came in tones of money or noise. That morning the town gathered early, not for duty, but for spectacle, whispers crackling like dry leaves through the air, betting eyes sharp with gossip. Coulter Holt adjusted the collar of his cleanest shirt, one stitched by Sarah herself, and worn with the uncomfortable stiffness of borrowed dignity. Beside him, Talia stood in a navy blue dress, her hair pulled back in a braid, Sarah's silver pin anchoring the end. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her small hand found his as they walked up those heavy steps together. Inside the courtroom was cold wooden pews and stricter faces. The Burkes sat 3 rows back, dressed in somber finery, their posture sharpened by smug certainty. Mr. Burke's hands were folded like he was already saying grace over a meal he thought he'd won. Mrs. Burke clutched a lace-trimmed handkerchief, dabbing dry eyes. Judge Emery sat at the bench, gray-bearded and narrow-eyed, a man known for chewing words before he spoke them. Sheriff Boone stood to the side, arms crossed, neutral in stance but not in gaze. Sarah Callahan, seated quietly in the back, gave a subtle nod when Talia glanced her way. The courtroom settled. The child welfare agent, Miss Darlene Whitaker, was first to speak, reading reports in a voice designed to soothe, but sharpened to cut. She talked of protocol, of stability, of how Talia's current environment, while emotionally nurturing, lacked the resources, community integration, and appropriate maternal influence necessary for healthy upbringing. Then came the Burkes. Mr. Burke stood with slow, practiced movements. "We only want what's best for the child. We've got the room, the means, the education. She could learn piano, attend Sunday school, have a proper upbringing among folks who know right from wrong." He turned toward the judge. What can a man like Holt offer her but solitude and suspicion? A ranch isn't a home. It's a holding pen. Coulter didn't flinch. He waited until the judge called his name. Then he stood. The courtroom hushed. He looked straight ahead, not at the judge, not at the Burkes, but toward Talia. "I'm not a man with fine words or fine clothes," he began, voice low but steady. "I didn't plan for her, didn't ask. But the Lord dropped her in front of me like a bolt out of blue, and I ain't turned away." He turned now to Judge Emery. "You ask what I offer my hands which built her bed, my back which shields her when storms roll in, my voice which speaks her name when she's too tired to cry it herself. I can't teach her piano, but I've shown her how to listen to wind and know when the coyotes come too close. I've shown her how to plant something, watch it grow, and know it matters." Coulter's jaw tightened. "She ain't my blood, but she's my heart, and I'll fight any man or law who tries to tear her from it." Judge Emery studied him for a long moment. Then, with a nod, he turned to Talia. "Do you have anything you wish to say, child?" Talia's small feet stepped forward, the sound of her shoes on the floor, echoing like distant hoofbeats. She stood at the front, eyes wide but sure hands clasped in front of her. "They call me a child," she began, "but I've been the one cooking beans on a cold stove with no matches. I've wrapped my own arms when no one else would. Mr. Holt Coulter, he didn't ask for me, but he made room for me." Her voice didn't tremble. "He made space where there was none, and he gave me quiet. Not the kind that hurts, but the kind that feels like breathing." She glanced back at Sarah, then to the Burkes. "I don't need lace. I don't need piano. I need someone who sees me when I don't know how to be seen. I need Coulter." The courtroom was still. Even Mrs. Burke lowered her eyes. Judge Emery cleared his throat, the gravel in it breaking the silence. Court will reconvene after recess. I'll return with my decision. Outside, the sky had darkened thunderheads building on the horizon. Coulter sat on the front steps, elbows on his knees, hands tight. Talia leaned into his side. Neither of them spoke. Behind them, Sarah approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You said what needed saying," she murmured, handing one to Coulter. "Won't matter if he don't hear it." Sarah shook her head. "Oh, he heard. The question is, does he have the courage to act on it?" Inside, the judge returned 15 minutes later. He removed his glasses, folded them slowly, and laid them beside his gavel. "In matters such as this," he said, "the law is meant to serve the best interest of the child, not the comfort of the court or the approval of the town. I've seen too many children moved like parcels from one clean house to another, only to be left emptier than before." His eyes met Coulter's. "Mr. Holt, you are awarded full guardianship pending quarterly reviews. The child will remain with you." A collective stir passed through the room like wind through wheat. The Burkes did not protest. Mr. Burke stood quickly, mouth drawn tight, and ushered his wife from the pew. Talia turned toward Coulter. His face didn't change, not at first, but his hand squeezed hers, like he might never let go again. When they left the courthouse, the wind had risen sharp and wild. Rain spit across the dirt like angry whispers. Talia laughed, for the first time in weeks. "Guess the sky heard too," she said. Coulter smiled. "Let it rain. We've got roots now." They rode back to the ranch in silence, thunder cracking behind them. But the silence between them wasn't empty anymore, it was full of belonging. At the edge of the property, the wind snapped a low branch, sending it tumbling across the yard. Talia jumped from the wagon to catch it. She held it up like a trophy. "Still green inside," she called. Coulter nodded. "Means it's still growing. Just lost its footing for a minute." Inside the house, the fire crackled. Boots were left by the door. Wet clothes hung over the railing. And upstairs in the room with the silver pin resting on the nightstand, Talia pressed her hand to the window pane and whispered, "We're staying." And for the first time, she believed it. "You don't owe me perfect, Talia. You just owe me your truth." The late August sun melted across the prairie like warm butter, casting a golden hush over Windmere Ranch. It had been 3 weeks since the courthouse hearing, and Coulter Holt could finally exhale without looking over his shoulder. The papers were signed, sealed, and filed. Talia was his now on paper, as she had long been in heart. But something had shifted in her. Coulter first noticed it the morning she skipped breakfast. That alone wasn't alarming. Kids had moods like weather. But then came the restless pacing, the books she left unopened, the way she'd start feeding the chickens, only to forget halfway through and wander off toward the tree line. Even Rusty the red heeler pup they'd adopted last week couldn't coax a smile from her. She hadn't drawn anything in days. "Maybe she's just tired," Sarah offered as she washed radishes on the back porch. "All the court stuff. Maybe it's just catching up to her now that she finally has space to feel it." Coulter leaned against the post arms, crossed gaze fixed on the barn where Talia had disappeared hours ago. "She's not saying much. Every time I ask, I get that fake little smile, the one that don't quite touch her eyes." "She's trying not to rock the boat," Sarah said softly. "She's seen boats capsize before." Coulter nodded, heart-twisting. He'd seen it too. That kind of silence didn't mean peace. It meant storm was building. That evening, just before supper, Coulter walked out to the barn. The door creaked open to reveal Talia in the hayloft, curled up against a beam, hugging her sketchbook, like it was armor. She didn't look up when he climbed the ladder. He didn't speak right away, just sat on the opposite beam hat in his lap, the air between them filled with swallows darting through the rafters. "Remember that coyote last spring," he said eventually. Talia looked up just barely. The one that got tangled in the fence. Mean as spit. I was sure he'd bite clean through my arm if I got close. Talia blinked at him, confused. But then I saw his paw was mangled. Real bad. All that growling, it wasn't hate. It was fear. She watched him now. "Sometimes hurt comes out sideways," Coulter said. "Biting and scratching even when you don't want it to. But you can't fix it till you look at it square." She stayed quiet. Coulter let the silence settle again before adding, "You don't owe me perfect, Talia. You just owe me your truth." That cracked something in her. Her fingers tightened on the sketchbook, and when she spoke, her voice was barely more than breath. "I'm scared you'll stop wanting me." Coulter's brows knit. "Why would you think that?" "Because I mess up. Because I get mad for no reason. Because I—" Her voice broke and her eyes welled up. "Because maybe the Burkes were right. Maybe I'm too broken." Coulter scooted closer, not touching, just near. "You ain't broken. You're bruised. Big difference." She shook her head. "I still have nightmares. I still remember things I don't want to remember. Sometimes I can't breathe. Sometimes I just want to disappear so I don't ruin anything good." Coulter's chest ached, not from shock, but from the weight she'd been carrying alone. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out something small, a nail bent and rusted. "Took this out of the barn floor last week," he said. "Stepped on it once. Damn near went through my boot. Nearly tossed it out. But then I remembered this barn was built by my father. That nail held up the hayloft beam for years." He handed it to her. "Still got value. Still tells a story. Just ain't where it used to be." Talia turned the nail over in her fingers, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "You think I'm like that nail," she whispered. "I think you're tougher." She looked up, finally meeting his eyes. The storm inside her was still there, but it had softened like clouds thinning before sunset. Later that night, she brought her sketchbook to dinner. Didn't open it, but kept it beside her plate. It was enough. Coulter and Sarah didn't press. The next morning, she handed Coulter a drawing. It was of the ranch sketched in soft charcoal, but unlike her usual work, this one was different. There were shadows, dark smudges near the barn, rough patches on the fencing, broken shingles on the roof. But in the center was a light coming from the house windows, and in front stood 3 small figures, a man, a woman, and a girl with wind-blown hair and boots too big for her. Coulter looked at it for a long time. "You see us," he murmured. Talia nodded. "And I see you," he said. "All of you." For the next week she seemed lighter. Not fixed, but freer. She went back to feeding the chickens, even taught Rusty to fetch the rope. She sat on the porch again, sketching wildflowers. And in the evenings she laughed, not the polite kind, but the real kind that started in her chest. But healing wasn't a straight line. One evening, after helping Sarah bake cornbread, Talia stood at the stove and suddenly froze, the wooden spoon slipping from her hand. She stared blankly ahead, chest rising in short, panicked bursts. Coulter was at her side in seconds. "Hey. Hey now," he said gently. "You with me?" Her eyes were wide, glassy. "I smell her perfume," she whispered. "Mama's, it's not here, but it feels like she is." Coulter nodded slowly. "Sometimes smells carry ghosts." She began to tremble. Coulter guided her to the rocker by the fireplace, sat beside her, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "Let it come," he said softly. "Don't fight it." Talia cried then, not the quiet, controlled tears. These were raw, guttural sobs, pain she'd stored in the corners of her soul. Sarah knelt by her feet, holding her hand. "I miss her so much," Talia said through broken gasps. "Even when she forgot my birthday. Even when she left me behind." Coulter swallowed the lump in his throat. "Love don't always make sense, kid. And it don't disappear just because someone's gone or did wrong." That night they left the fire burning longer than usual. Coulter slept in the chair beside her rocker, Rusty curled at her feet. No one spoke of strength or bravery. They just existed together in the same soft space. And in the quiet hours before dawn, Talia whispered, "I think I'm starting to believe I'm allowed to be okay." Coulter, eyes still closed, murmured, "You're not just allowed. You're meant to." Rain tapped gently at the windows. The wind moved through the prairie like a lullaby. And for the first time, Talia dreamed not of the past, but of a future. One with laughter. One with thunder and sunlight. One where she belonged wholly and without condition. "I used to think I was just visiting this life, but maybe I've been home all along." Talia stood at the edge of the pasture, arms folded tight against the early morning chill. The frost clung to the fence wire, glittering like stars trapped in dew. Beyond the rising mist, the cattle stirred slow steam rising off their backs, like ghosts lifting into dawn. Coulter watched her from the barn doorway, one boot braced against the frame coffee cup warm in his hand. He didn't call to her, didn't break the spell. Some mornings, silence said more than words ever could. She had changed, not just in the way she walked taller or how her shoulders had loosened. It was in the steadiness of her presence, in how she held space, no longer shrinking into the corners. He approached only when she finally exhaled her breath, painting clouds in the air. "Cold one," he said gently. Talia nodded, but clear. They stood together like that, shoulder to shoulder. No urgency, no rush. "I dreamed about Mama last night," she murmured. "But it wasn't scary. We were on the porch. She was brushing my hair like she used to, humming that Patsy Cline song." Coulter sipped from his mug. "Sounds peaceful?" It was. Her gaze drifted toward the barn cat weaving through frost-bitten weeds. "I think I'm learning to hold the good parts without getting buried by the bad," Coulter smiled faintly. "That's all any of us can do." Inside the house, Sarah had the kitchen humming. Cornbread in the oven, beans simmering slow. Talia rolled up her sleeves to help without being asked, kneading dough, checking measurements, humming to herself. Later that day at school, Talia sat in her usual spot at the back of the art room, sketchbook open, eyes focused. Miss Landry leaned over, noting the scene unfolding in graphite, an old barn under snowfall, a girl and dog racing across the field, wind whipping joy into their silhouettes. "This is new," the teacher said softly. "Lighter." Talia smiled, cheeks pink. "It's Windmere." Ms. Landry's eyes twinkled. "Looks like home." Talia hesitated, then whispered, "It is." After school, Coulter picked her up in his truck like usual, dog panting in the back seat. But as they rumbled down the gravel road, Talia spoke before he could ask how her day went. "Can we stop by the cemetery?" He blinked, surprised, but nodded. Of course. The sun was hanging low, throwing long gold fingers over the hills by the time they pulled into the small country lot. The wind carried whispers through brittle leaves. Talia clutched a folded paper and a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She walked with purpose to her mother's grave, kneeling slowly. Coulter stayed back, giving her space, hands shoved into his coat pockets. Talia placed the bundle gently beside the stone. Inside was a tiny drawing of their kitchen, the three of them sitting at the table, laughing, eating chili. Rusty curled underfoot. She unfolded the note and read aloud, voice barely rising above the breeze. "I used to think you left because I wasn't enough. But now I know you were lost. And maybe you couldn't stay, but I'm still here. I'm okay now, Mama. I'm safe. The wind picked up like breath catching through pine. I love you, she added, brushing her fingers over the stone. I always will, but I don't have to stay sad to prove it. Back in the truck, Coulter said nothing. He didn't need to. His eyes glistened when she glanced his way, and his hand reached over to squeeze hers. That night at dinner, Sarah noticed something different in Talia's voice. Not louder, but clearer. The weight behind it had changed. I want to do the school art fair, Talia announced between bites of cornbread. Coulter raised his brows. The one with the gallery show. Talia nodded. And the speech. Sarah nearly dropped her fork. You want to speak in front of people, I want to try. Coulter leaned back, a grin slowly spreading. I think that's a mighty fine idea. They spent the next week prepping. Talia worked on her portfolio in the evenings, Coulter helping frame the drawings. Sarah coached her through her speech, gentle but firm, correcting posture and pacing like a proud stage mom. Each night, Talia grew more confident, not just in her words, but in her worth. She started leaving her door cracked open at night. She slept with one arm draped over Rusty instead of clutching herself tight. She laughed with her whole face. The day of the fair arrived with bright skies and the buzz of spring waking the world again. The school gym was transformed into a patchwork of canvases, colors, and youthful ambition. Families bustled between rows of artwork camera flashes, lighting proud faces. Talia stood beside her display charcoal sketches of the ranch watercolor dreams, of freedom, a centerpiece painting of a girl in boots, running across open fields with a dog at her heels. It was titled, Becoming. When the mic was handed to her for her speech, her hands trembled only slightly. Sarah stood near the exit, Coulter just behind the last row. Principal Harris adjusted the mic. You ready? He asked. Talia took a breath, her gaze sweeping the crowd, then settling on Coulter. She smiled, not nervous, not apologetic. Just sure. I used to think I was just visiting this life, but maybe I've been home all along, she began, voice strong. When I came to Windmere Ranch, I didn't know if I could belong anywhere. I carried fear like a shadow. But I've learned that belonging isn't about where you start. It's about where you're loved back. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some parents teared up. Ms. Landry covered her heart. I found my place not because someone saved me, she continued, but because someone saw me. And stayed. Even when I was hard to hold. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Coulter clapped the loudest, his eyes glassy. Sarah cried openly. Afterward, kids swarmed her, complimenting her artwork. A few parents asked if she'd be selling prints. Talia beamed. She didn't shrink. She stood and soaked in the joy like sunlight on skin. That night, Coulter grilled steaks on the back porch. Sarah whipped up sweet tea, and Talia set the table under strings of fairy lights they hadn't lit since the county fair. They ate outside stars, blinking awake one by one. You nailed that speech, Coulter said, nudging her elbow. Talia grinned. You think so? I think you did more than speak. You lit the place up. She leaned her head on his shoulder, content. And as the wind shifted and coyotes called in the distance, Coulter felt it deep in his chest. Something settling, something sacred. Talia wasn't just healing. She was home. You don't erase the past by forgetting it. You rewrite it by living better. The sunrise over Windmere Ranch painted the sky in soft streaks of apricot and lavender, casting long shadows across the dewy grass. Talia stood barefoot on the porch, warm coffee cradled in her hands. It was the first day of summer break, and everything around her buzzed with a sense of newness. Even the birdsong sounded different, more assured, more like a welcome than a warning. Inside, Sarah hummed along to an old Patsy Cline record, her fingers deftly folding laundry on the couch. The house smelled of cinnamon rolls and furniture polish. Rusty lay sprawled beneath the kitchen table, his tail thumping against the floor each time someone passed by. Coulter had already left to repair a broken gate on the north end of the property, but not before leaving a note tucked beside Talia's bowl of oatmeal, "See the world like it's the first time, kiddo. It'll never get old that way." Talia smiled as she reread it, folding the slip of paper into her back pocket like a secret. She didn't just feel like she belonged at Windermere, now she felt responsible for it. The rhythms of ranch life no longer felt foreign or burdensome. They were hers too. From mucking stalls to hauling feed, from gathering eggs to mending fence lines, each act rooted her deeper. But it wasn't just chores. It was trust. It was quiet mornings like these where she didn't flinch at the sound of her name or startle when someone raised their voice in the distance. It was learning that love didn't come with strings or threats. Talia's art portfolio had been accepted into a regional youth showcase. Ms. Landry had dropped off the news herself, practically dancing in the driveway. The painting Becoming would be the centerpiece. It was validation, but more than that, it was a bridge. "I want to teach art," Talia had told Sarah the night before, lying on her back in the hayloft, eyes tracing the dusty beams above. "You'd be amazing," Sarah had whispered, brushing hair from Talia's cheek. "You've already taught us how to see." That afternoon, they hosted the first Windermere Open House, a casual celebration meant to introduce the ranch's new community program. It had been Coulter's idea, inspired by Talia's journey. A safe space for kids who needed more than a place to sleep, who needed soil and sky and someone to listen. Neighbors, school board members, foster agency reps, and curious families wandered the ranch with paper cups of lemonade, munching on deviled eggs and listening to Coulter explain the project with his usual drawling modesty. Talia guided the children's art station near the barn, where a table overflowed with paints, brushes, chalk, and sketchbooks. She wore a denim apron smeared in color and her favorite straw hat with the fraying ribbon. A little girl with dark curls, Shay held up her painting of a horse with wings. "Do you think it's dumb?" Shay whispered. Talia crouched to eye level. "I think it's brave, giving something heavy wings that takes vision." Shay's eyes widened and a smile broke across her face like sun after rain. When the group moved into the shade for closing remarks, Coulter gestured to the hand-painted sign nailed above the barn door, "Windermere Roots, Healing with Horses and Home." "We're not trying to save anyone," he said, voice carrying across the quiet. "We're just offering a place where folks can remember who they are, or figure it out for the first time." Applause rippled. Talia stood beside him, holding Rusty's leash, her cheeks burning with quiet pride. As people drifted toward their cars, Sarah appeared at her side. "You did good today," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind Talia's ear. "I didn't think I'd ever have something to give," Talia murmured. "You've got more to give than most folks I've met." They stood together, watching the last of the guests disappear down the gravel road. The late sun pooled golden across the grass. That evening, Coulter drove them into town for burgers and milkshakes at Miller's Diner. A post-celebration tradition he insisted on starting. Talia pressed her nose against the truck window, watching fireflies dance over the roadside fields. Sarah flipped through radio stations, stopping when she found an old country ballad. At the diner, they claimed the corner booth. Talia ordered a double chocolate shake, and Sarah rolled her eyes before doing the same. "I keep thinking about those kids today," Talia said, dipping a fry in ranch. "How they looked scared at first, like I used to." Coulter leaned back, hands behind his head. "Yeah, but then they saw you weren't." Talia looked down. Sometimes I still get scared. Being brave doesn't mean you never feel fear, Sarah said. It just means you know what to do with it. Talia nodded, absorbing that like scripture. When they returned home, the porch light buzzed faintly as they climbed the steps. Rusty trotted up ahead, tail wagging like a metronome. Fireflies winked in the brush, and the crickets had taken over the night. Talia lingered behind a moment, staring up at the stars. She remembered the night she'd arrived, soaked in fear and silence. The moon had seemed like a judge back then, watchful, distant. But tonight, it felt like a witness. Inside, she wandered to her room and opened the sketchbook she hadn't touched since the art fair. She flipped past old drawings' faces with hollow eyes, shadows swallowing edges, and paused on a blank page. She dipped her brush into blue, then green, then gold. When the image emerged, it was of 3 figures standing in a pasture, arms linked. The barn in the distance, a horse running free. Above them, a sky full of fireflies and stars. She titled it, Homecoming. A knock tapped gently on her door. "Hey," Coulter said, peeking in. "Got a sec?" She nodded, setting the brush down. He stepped inside, holding out a small, worn leather box. "This was my mother's," he said. "She passed when I was about your age. She used to keep her good things in here. I think she'd want you to have it." Talia opened the box slowly. Inside was a pressed flower, a silver necklace, and a tiny hand-stitched heart made of red felt. "Thank you," she whispered, throat tightening. Coulter's voice softened. "You're part of this family, Talia. Not out of charity. Not till you mess up. You belong here. Permanently." Her eyes brimmed, but she didn't cry. She stood and hugged him hard. "I love you, Coulter. I love you too, kiddo." As he left the room, she returned to the desk and slid the stitched heart gently into the center of the painting, gluing it in place. "You don't erase the past by forgetting it," she whispered to herself. "You rewrite it by living better." The wind outside rustled the trees like applause. Talia pulled the quilt over her legs and let the hush of Windmere rock her to sleep. The educational lesson learned from this story is that belonging is not created by papers, wealth, or appearances, but by steady presence, patience, and the willingness to stay when things are difficult. Life reminds us that healing often happens quietly through daily routines, shared meals, honest conversations, and simple acts of care that rebuild trust over time. Even later in life, it is still possible to offer someone safety, purpose, and dignity, and in doing so, rediscover those same things within ourselves. Love, when given without conditions or hurry, has the power to reshape both the broken past and the years still ahead.